They're all set up. So we're here to discuss this proposal in front of City Council called Bring Chicago Home. First, let me explain the procedure, where we are at in the process. I assume you've all heard of it. At the moment, the proposal is actually a proposal for a resolution. And if the resolution passes, then it'll go to referendum for the voters on March 19th. And currently it's in the Rules Committee, we don't know when it might come to City Council. They're basically looking for the votes now. If the referendum passes with 50%, it goes back to City Council, and everybody expects that they would pass it, if it passes referendum. Technically, it also has to be approved by the state. The state is pretty much said if it passes the referendum, that's it. Okay, so next. Okay, the details of the plan. It's basically about a tax, about the real estate transfer tax. So when you sell a real estate property, that transfer tax is the amount that I think in Illinois and in Chicago, the buyer pays a certain percent of the cost of the property. And currently that rate is 0.75% for all properties. So according to the current form of the proposal, it could change. The current form of the proposal for properties worth less than $1 million, the rate would actually go down to 0.6%. Okay, so it's like a 20% reduction. Okay. Okay, that rate also applies to affordable properties. So if a building has affordable units, even if they're worth more than $1 million, it would still be at that 0.6 rate. Okay. Now it gets complicated, which we don't need to go into the different kinds of affordable properties. That's beyond my pay grade. Okay, from 1 million. So under the current state of the proposal, between properties worth between 1 million and 1.5 million, the marginal rate would go up to 2%. So that means just for the amount above $1 million. The part less than $1 million still would be at 0.6%. Then for properties worth more than 1.5 million, so like big downtown properties, the marginal rate is 3%. That's a quadrupling of the current rate. Okay. So I'm going to have to look at this while I say this. I can't remember every detail now. So what will happen with the money? A lot of people have asked me that. In the new version of the plan, only the extra amount that's being collected. So what's being collected, what's at 0.6% would not go to this special revenue stream. Only the extra, only the extra amount would go into a special fund called the Bring Chicago Home Fund. And then there would be produced, we'll talk a little bit more about it, an advisory board, the Bring Chicago Home Advisory Board. And then they would recommend, they would talk with the heads of the relevant departments, the Department of Family and Support Services, Housing, and Public Health, to determine where, to set the budget on how much of that money should go where. And the stated purpose of the plan, you can see up there, is to provide for permanent affordable housing, but also services necessary to maintain permanent housing. Those, I think, are the words from the ordinance. Next. Okay, so you may have seen in papers some discrepancies about how many homeless there are. If you look at the report by the Department of Family and Children's Services, I think we'll get the exact numbers. Alderman Cappleman.
Yeah, I can provide all that.
Yeah, he'll give more detail on this. But there's a federal definition, but that is 6,000 something. But the Bring Chicago Home Plan would also include people who, quote, are in a situation of housing instability. So doubling up, and I can't go into the details exactly what that'll include, but that actually multiplies by 10 the number of people. So in other words, Bring Chicago Home Fund could help serve people who are not defined as homeless by the federal government. Okay, got that straight? Next. And there's some detail, this is just a couple of examples of how the money can be spent. Eligible uses or allowable expenses of the fund. So a couple interesting examples. Certain capital costs for existing congregate shelter. Congregate shelters, when you have a bunch of cots lined up. So the money could go to improve this situation there. And so not just permanent shelter. And it can also, for example, it could be used to expand operations from traditional overnight to 24-hour shelter. Okay, next. Now, this brings Chicago Home Advisory Board, which is not very well known yet. So here are some details about it. I don't think I need to go into all of it. But it would have 15 voting members. There'd be 3 ex officio members, the relevant commissioners I mentioned before. And then, interesting thing, each of the commissioners would get to choose an assistant to be a non-voting member. And then 2 more people appointed by the mayor. And then the actual voting members would be for 3-year terms, people with expertise or special experience working with the homeless. Okay? And then some of the things the board would do. They would hold public meetings and seek community outreach. They would make recommendations regarding how the revenue should be spent. For eligible uses, they would establish goals and metrics. Okay, that's happening somewhere else in our government already, so that's an interesting addition. And the last one, tracking participant program outcomes, basically program evaluation. Okay, so that's an overview. I think that's it. Okay, I just want to say a couple more things. We are going to be a membership organization. We're just starting out, but it's a very, very cheap $10 to be a member, and that would give you the right to vote at meetings. And Cynthia back here is our substitute treasurer. So you can pay by cash. If you have cash, you can pay. She's got receipts for you, or check. And also on every table, there's a QR code. You can go right to our PayPal.
We're taking donations as well.
Okay, and we are not going to turn down extra money.
Yes, taking donations.
Okay, so on to the real speakers. So the first will be Alderman Cappleman, you probably all know, and he's got a lot of experience with city policy around homelessness. So he's going to give us an overview as to how the system works now.
Yes, great. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Daniel. This organization is very, very important. I really strongly believe in the need for dialogue and civil conversation. A brief background: before I was an alderman, I was a social worker. I focused a lot. Actually, I focused on people with mental illness, and one of my first jobs was at Travelers Immigrants Aid, which is now Heart Alliance. Worked with refugees, but then later worked with people who had HIV, who were injecting drug users, who had mental illness, who were experiencing homelessness in the community of Uptown, which is where I live right now. I started out as a social worker in the 1980s when HIV was just wreaking havoc, and at the time, people with HIV could not go to nursing homes because they would empty out, and so a friend of mine and I, we founded a homeless shelter for people with HIV, really just so they would have a place to die. But when nursing homes started accepting people with HIV, there was no need to have our shelter. And then, as an alderman, the forensics was unusual. I think a little over 40% of all the shelters exist within 5 blocks of one another in the Uptown community. So we're a community that has focused on the need for people experiencing homelessness. And whereas most communities don't like having shelters, it's not that big of a deal in the Uptown community. And we're working to improve that so that there's a more equitable distribution because it's not only good for people experiencing homelessness, it's good for the communities, other communities to also step in and help. I found that when I was an alderman, I would focus a lot on homelessness, but aldermen who were in wards where there were no shelters, it wasn't on their radar. So let's start out with a definition of homelessness. There's two primary different definitions. One is the federal. The federal definition is a person who has been experiencing homelessness for 12 months or more, or a period of 3 years has been homeless for 12 months for 4 times. What the federal government does is they have every year, there's a point in time count. This point in time count, they try to make it at a time of year where they believe it's going to be the coldest, and so the same day across the country. And they do that because they want to have as an accurate account as possible. They count people living on the streets, and they also, and in encampments, and they also count people living in shelters. I participated in the homeless count at one point. We also looked at where we knew people would be living sometimes abandoned buildings, but we tried to do a very accurate account. What we found, in this point in time count for 2023, there were 6,139 people experiencing homelessness. Of this group, 16% of them were sleeping outside during that count, and 36% of them were asylum seekers. Now, the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, they have a different way that they make a count, and they include people who are doubled up in apartments. And their count was 68,340 people, or it's around 11 times higher. Now, both definitions have some good points to them. The federal government, they realize that people who are doubled up, it's very hard to get an accurate number. And they want as accurate number as possible so there could be an equitable distribution of resources. So they purposely do not count doubled up because it's too difficult to make an accurate count. And so that's why it is the way it is. The federal government also realizes that people who are doubled up also experiencing homelessness. I used to be a Franciscan friar, and when I left the order, I had $200 to my name with no job. I was technically homeless for 4 months, but I did not meet the federal government's definition of that. The numbers that the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless provide, I think, are important because it talks about the gravity of this issue. I mean, it's a very serious issue. So both definitions have their place. So I understand that. So best practices around the country have found that there are 2 major components when we are addressing homelessness. One is making sure that we have a coordinated and collaborative response of different city departments, different levels of government, city, county, state, federal, and social services all working together, utilizing best practices, focusing on outcome measures, making sure that people who are experiencing homelessness is time limited and they're off the streets as quickly as possible. And then the other piece that's very important is making sure that we have sufficient affordable housing in place. So both components are very important. And when we're looking at the coordinated and collaborative response to addressing homelessness, which is with all the different social services, we find that around maybe just over 15% of the people who are experiencing homelessness are experiencing chronic homelessness. And these are the people you see in encampments. They're living on the sides of the street. They're living in the park. This is a group where the cost of their care is pretty high. It averages $3,000 a month per person living on the streets. It's actually cheaper to house someone who's living on the streets to house them in an apartment. We save money doing that. And then if you're looking at their medical care quadruples when they're living on the streets. So we really do save money by having them housed. So if we're looking at what are some of the best practices in helping to reach out to these individuals, especially those who are resistant to getting care, it's case management. Case management is powerful. I was a case manager at Heartland Alliance. And so my first job as a case manager is to create a trusting relationship with that person who needs housing. And there are many reasons why they do not trust. Some of them have been burned horribly by the process. Some of them have paranoid schizophrenia, and there's just all multiple reasons. And so they may be resistant to obtaining housing, but it's just because of what they're going through. And so that's important for that case manager. Once that case manager starts developing that trusting relationship, which is sometimes can be very difficult, especially for a person with mental illness who's gone without their medications for a long time. It's very, very hard to engage that person. But once they do that, then they look at what are some of the reasons why this person has been stuck in this cycle of homelessness. And what we're finding is this population generally falls in 5 categories. They are people who are aging out of the foster care system. And as a social worker who's worked with DCFS a lot, some of these people in the foster care system have been treated horribly. I can give you horror stories that I don't want to tell you about. I wish I could remember them. So there's that group. There are people with chronic mental illness. There are people with a substance use disorder, and sometimes that substance use disorder is a coexisting issue with their chronic mental illness where they're self-medicating. And then there's a disproportionate number of the LGBTQI community who are also experiencing homelessness. And then people experiencing domestic violence. So those 5 groups are the ones that we see a lot. Domestic violence. So we have a disproportionate number of people who are experiencing domestic violence who are experiencing homelessness. So when the case manager works with these individuals, one of the first things that we're asked to do, and this is a dictate from the federal government, is we must enroll them into the HMIS system. That's the Homeless Management Information System. And this tracks that person so that we know where they're getting services, we know what combination of services they're getting, or whether it's just one service provider, and then we can use that information to determine what's working well in the system to get someone quickly housed. And then we can also identify what are some of the obstacles in place that slow down that process. The bad news is Chicago is behind in doing an analysis of HMIS to see what the issues are, and shame on us that happened. The good news is that HUD has provided $60 million to the city through All Chicago, and All Chicago is a consortium of providers. And they're using these funds to do a deep dive analysis so that we can really focus on what works and what doesn't work. Overall, I'm very pleased by what we're doing as a city to address homelessness. I'm still extremely frustrated, and I can go on hours about both, but I think that there's some great things happening. When it comes to supportive, affordable housing, as of 2021, over 1/3 of all the housing that exists in the city of Chicago is affordable. That surprises a lot of people. And affordable means it's affordable to people who earn 60% of the area median income or less. And that's how the city defines affordable, and the federal government. So for a single person, that person earns around $46,000 a year. For a family of 3, they earn around $60,000. Our problem is our largest group of renters earn less than 30% of the area median income. So that's around $23,000, and if you're an SSI, supplemental security income, you earn half of that. And those are the people that are hardest to house. When we're looking at all the affordable housing in the city, the largest group of affordable housing is naturally occurring affordable housing. Naturally occurring affordable housing is housing owned by private owners. It's the mom and pop 2 flats, 3 flats, 6 flats, courtyard buildings. That's where we have a lot of our affordable housing. The remaining 40% is HUD, CHA, nonprofit, and affordable requirements ordinance housing. Affordable housing, the affordable requirements ordinance housing is when a developer develops property and wants a zoning change for a property with 10 units or more, 20% of those units have to be set aside. The city and the public and my colleagues focus most on the affordable requirements ordinance, but less than 2% of all the affordable housing in the city is through the affordable requirements ordinance. Most of it is through naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA.
And what was the percentage again?
60% is NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. The remaining is 40%. I am a huge proponent of encouraging more NOAA for a number of different reasons. This is the type of housing that provides, that receives Chicago Low-Income Housing Trust Fund, rental subsidies. This is the money used to help a lot of people who've been living on the streets. 1/3 of those individuals receiving these funds have zero income. So it's really important that we provide this amount of housing for that particular group. The other thing is HUD, CHA, and not-for-profit, they have long waiting lists. So it's very hard to get in. Naturally occurring affordable housing, it's not so hard. CHA has an extensive financial background check. So it's very hard, and many people experiencing chronic homelessness, especially if they have disabling conditions, say mental illness, they have huge debt, so that they disqualify. You also, because it receives federal dollars, you're not allowed to use cannabis inside any housing that gets federal subsidies. NOAA housing costs less than 1/2 of HUD or CHA or not-for-profit housing. And it costs less than half because there are fewer requirements, and it's much easier to obtain a loan. The other reason why I love NOAA is there's less drawback, pushback from the community. Because when a proposal is being brought forward to the community, if it's CHA or HUD, there's pushback, or not-for-profit housing. No, people don't care. It's just not that big of a deal. So I think that's really important. So to promote more NOAA, and this is now the entire country is recognizing the need to really promote more NOAA housing. I'm going to give 3 suggestions. 2 most of the public hate. One is increased density. If you increase density, it's cheaper to build because the cost of housing is skyrocketing. The other one that makes a lot of noise among the community residents is reducing parking requirements, because parking is very expensive. That's why the city pushed the TOD, transit-oriented development. And a lot of people with extremely low incomes, they can't afford cars anyway, so it just makes a lot of sense to push that. And the other one is, I don't see enough of, but the state of Illinois just recently started providing property tax incentives. We're just now doing that for people who earn less than 60%, who earn around 60% of the AMI. Landlords are getting property tax incentives. My issue is we need that property tax incentive for people who earn 15% or 30% of the AMI, and we're not seeing that. So I'll close with this. Homelessness is a very complex issue. There's no one simple, easy answer. My experience as an alderman is that getting different people together with differing points of view allow us to hear one another. It allows us to recognize unintended consequences so real good plans occur. And that's it for me.
Okay, our next speaker is Robin McPherson. We really have to thank her because she did this on like one day's notice. So and she's also she works with Heartland Alliance still, right?
Yes.
For many years. And she'll draw on her experience explaining why, well, you can say what you're doing. But I think we'll get a sense of why more money for the homeless is needed.
Good evening, everybody. I am Robin McPherson. As Daniel said, I work for Heartland Alliance for 20 years now. My anniversary will be December the 3rd. I started at Heartland Alliance because of gentrification. I got involved in my community. I live in Rogers Park, and I've been living in Rogers Park 38 years. So I got involved with nonprofit housing organizations because of what I was seeing around me. I was comfortable. I was living in a co-op, a Pratt-Ashton co-op. I was one of the founders. So at that time, I was comfortable, you know, I had a good job in the suburbs or whatever. But these nonprofits got involved, and you know, they were door knocking, and they came to my home one day, and someone said, open your door and talk to them after working all day. Y'all was sitting on the couch. And I guess I was in my own little bubble, you know what I'm saying? I was just comfortable. And I really didn't know what was going on outside of my world. But, you know, knowledge is power. So when I started talking to them, going to the office, volunteering or whatever, I said, wow, this is what's really going on in the world. Homelessness. People are homeless. So I just started doing like actions with them, marches, this and that and all that. And one day someone just saw me, you know, out here doing, I used to be residential and attendance ordinance workshops throughout the city for this organization, you know, after working all week. And so somebody just saw me one day and said, wow, you should come work for us at Heartland Alliance. Somebody was there one day. And I'm like, okay, Heartland Alliance. And so I didn't know who they were, but eventually they told me this and that. So I got my resume together. And I got hired, but I quit my job. I was working in the suburbs at an insurance company, you know. I just had to pray on it, to be honest, pray on it, and I did it. I decided to do it. I gave my 2 weeks notice. I said, I'm gonna do this, you know. I'm gonna help people, because to me, I was shuffling paper, working in the environment I was working in, really just shuffling paper all day, answering the phone and stuff like that. So I'm just saying that's how I got involved with this cause of homelessness. And so I worked at Heartland Alliance, different programs, like I've worked with HIV, AFC funded programs. I've worked with CHA relocation programs. I've worked just doing, in 2008, you know, President Obama, when he had the funding for employment and for housing for 18 months, I forgot the name of that program. I did that program, I did many. But right now, I'm currently working in the rapid rehousing program. And that is a federal funded program. And the thing is only for 2 years. So my experience is lots of programs are permanent. And I think that's where we need funding, new organizations like this one, and we need more funding to make housing permanent for people. Because sometimes 2 years just allows a person to get on their feet, to find a way to decide, well, I want to get some job skills, or I want to, get, a degree, or I just want to work, period. And after 2 years, to me, from my experience, they still go back to homelessness. I could say out of 100%, the program I'm working at, the rapid rehousing, maybe 30% stabilize their housing. But the goal is to give them wraparound services along with the housing. But a lot of the programs, the wraparound services are not mandatory for them to utilize. So if they choose not to, and they 2 years are just living in this apartment, which is needed, they're back to where they were 2 years ago. So I just think the policies that are put in place, I know HUD, like you said, HUD, they got their definitions and the do's and the don'ts. I honestly, I don't think it's working to address the homeless problem, because people go back to homelessness. I think some of the policies need to be changed. It needs to just do what it takes to really work with people, you know, with the homeless situation they're in, and allow them to have permanent housing. And those wraparound services, I don't know if I'm dreaming, you know, the policies will get like that, but I just still don't understand today, why is it short term? Why is a lot of housing short term and not long term? Because there's just not enough funding, I would assume. So, with that being said, this group, you know, the people in the communities, the people who do this work, the people who just want to be a part of change, I think that's great. They are welcome, because that's how I started. I wanted to be a part of the change. But we need money. Bottom line, we need the money. And I hope having, you know, this organization, you do a lot of soul searching and a lot of, you know, talking about policies and get the money we need, you know, through the tax. So with that being said, that's it for me.
Let me just underline one important point of many that Robin made, that the way work on homelessness is now, it's only like 2 years at a time. So there's not very much long-term planning in the system. And so a lot of people argue that's why you need a dedicated revenue stream.
Yes.
Okay, so our last speaker, before we break out, we're going to be breaking out into discussions, I'll explain that afterward, is Farzin Parang, who's the Executive Director of the Building Owners and Managers Association of Chicago. And, you know, it's one thing to try to raise money for homelessness, but one of our purposes here is to consider, well, what consequences might there be that the people who draft legislation like this may not have thought of? So if I'm not mistaken, that's your name.
Yes, I'm here to advocate for keeping the homeless on the streets. Thank you for having me. I'm excited about the mission of this organization. I will give you a very brief on my background. I'm a lawyer by training. I actually spent most of my career working in the city in the mayor's office over 2 different administrations. I started with Mayor Daley, went through most of Mayor Emanuel's term. I was doing both, at one point, legislative crafting and sausage making, and that's how I actually worked. I had many calls from former Alderman Cappleman about homelessness. So when he talks about his frustration with the city, I have lived that experience. I did sort of a second stint in the mayor's office working on economic development. And then I'm now the executive director for about 3 years of BOMA Chicago, we call it. It is, as Daniel mentioned, it's the trade association for the office buildings, downtown, big office buildings. We're talking downtown office buildings, and then there's a little office park that's in the city. Technically, it's kind of out off the highway towards O'Hare. As a foundation point, I'll say bought in entirely the premise that we have a housing crisis. We actually have more than one housing crisis, and you layer on the migrant crisis on top of it. My unfortunate message is that we don't really have the luxury as a city of only having one or two crises at a time. We have a separate crisis in the office market, and I want to talk a little bit about what this tax base for the transfer tax is, what the proposed change means, and then I'll walk through a little bit about how that plays out and why it matters and what some of the impacts are. At the end of the day, well, I'll get there. Let me get there. So, first off, all this data is coming from my deck. You can pull it up yourself from the Illinois Department of Revenue's website. This is the data that when you do a transfer and it's subject to the transfer tax, you send this form to IDOR to declare it. And this just breaks down from 2015 to, it's an estimate of 2023. What is the tax base from across the different uses from the transfer tax? And I'm going to come back to 2015. That's kind of an important year. It was really our last high watermark in the office market in terms of trades, sales of buildings, and by extension, investor interest in Chicago's downtown. You can see that, if you can't see it, again, we'll come back to it. All the way on the left, you've got this commercial and office sort of at their peak. This might not be intuitive, it might be. 98% of the property value in Chicago is residential, single-family homes, condos, townhomes, duplexes. So it should come as no surprise. They're obviously bought and sold more often. There are more of them. They make up the majority of the transfer tax base. That's that black line way up top. And as you can see, what's generally considered commercial property, so that's office, retail, apartments, and whatnot, are kind of down at the bottom. They make a much smaller portion of the tax base. Here's just breaking it out into two different years. So this is 2022, same data. It just slices it. Look at the left first. This shows you the pie chart for who's making up the bulk of transfer tax revenues. And again, this is only the city of Chicago's transfer tax. There are different, the county and the state will have a transfer tax as well. So again, kind of consistent, right? 67%, the vast majority of it is single-family homes, condos, townhomes, duplexes. That's the big dark gray bar. Office is that 5% green, and then commercial. There's a little bit of overlap. This is a self-selected. When you file this form, you tell them what are you, office, and office or residential, whatever it might be. And I've noticed some people write commercial and then they write office, so there's a little bit of overlap there. Under the Bring Chicago Home, the current transfer tax proposal, the tiers, this is what that would have looked like in 2022. This was relatively not a strong year for commercial sales, for office sales. But you can see, again, the green, it goes from about 5% of office is made up in that tax base to 12%. Same with commercial goes from 5 to 9, and then the single-family home residential part drops to less than half. This is what it looks like in 2015. So again, this was our high watermark, and again, I'm going to come back to that. This is the high watermark for investor interest in our industry, and you can see it's a pretty dramatic difference, the impact of this tax, because you actually have transactions on the office side. So again, on the left, you've got, this is what it is under the current tax, what it was under the current tax structure. So about half single-family homes, about 15% office. Again, a much bigger chunk because you had more trades. Under the new model, if it were in place in 2015, that sort of residential, townhome, et cetera, drops to 21%, and office and residential really explode. And the purpose of this is really just to show you that the big impacts of this proposal is on office buildings and on commercial real estate. Why am I sort of stressing that? It's because the rhetoric about this tax is very different, right? Even though the data shows you it really is a tax on economic activity, this is called a mansion tax. You've probably heard that. So there's a couple challenges with this approach, and our note to folks is that you think about it very differently if you're thinking about it in terms of mansions than if you're thinking about what it's actually proposing and what the impact is on economic activity and what it means. So a couple themes come out. One is, and I'm going to return to this a few times, office buildings are not people. They're not mansions. There's a big distinction that matters, and I'll come to that. Increasing transfer taxes imposes public costs on everybody, and in fact that are counterproductive to the goal of improving housing affordability. And then third, given that there is a big public cost to this, we have to be very, very deliberate about what is the public benefit. What are we getting from this investment? So, to start off. Office buildings are not people, they are not mansions. So why does that matter? If you think about a mansion tax, and again, the rhetoric about all of this movement is, it's all about excess, right? You're not paying your fair share. If you think of a mansion, you think it's big and it's expensive. Doesn't really need to be, right? It's 2023, you don't really need to have 65,000 square feet for your own residence, right? That's the undercurrent of the argument for why this is a good tax. But again, office buildings, there's a logical kind of fallacy. There's a leap that is not logical, that office buildings are also large and they're expensive, but they don't represent excess. An office building is economic activity, right? That money that goes into building the office building is all an investment in Chicago. It is an investment that produces jobs, property taxes, a return on that investment. And the entire function of our industry is to go recruit that money, recruit that investment to Chicago. So again, it's a very different way of thinking about what is the consequence of this tax and why does it matter for everybody. Another note that real estate is also just structurally, it's a very difficult tool to try to force a progressive tax structure onto it. There's kind of a whole host of reasons why that's the case. For example, you can have an expensive building that is a rental building, right? It is rental housing, it's still expensive, so you're impacting rents and other things that are going on, even though the building might cost a lot and you might say, only on paper, well, this is again excess, or this is some wealth. Real estate is also a tool for saving wealth. It's not necessarily correlated with income or cash flow. You see a lot of conversations about seniors, right? A senior might be saving up, they're in retirement, they don't have any active cash flow, but their wealth is in their property. And so if you try to force a sort of progressive stack tax structure on that real estate, you are punishing people that might not actually have the income to pay it. That's a big component of gentrification, right? It's a contributor to gentrification that your property is now worth more than you can actually pay. Property taxes go up, you don't necessarily have the cash flow to manage that. And again, this underlying current that whenever you're increasing the cost of real estate, it does impact all the industries that we have in Chicago that are around real estate. So office, apartment developments, realtors, all of that activity. Okay, so what are the costs? And why does this matter for everybody? I'm going to talk, so again, I represent the office industry. We don't have any residential in the apartments. We are part of a coalition of a lot of business-related organizations that are real estate focused and not. That obviously represents a lot of folks who do apartments and residential and whatnot. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned from them, but I'm going to spend most of my time on office. So in the context of family housing, it is difficult to quantify and draw a direct line between increasing the transfer tax and increasing rent. That's not a super one-to-one correlation. There's a lot of different factors in the market that determine rent. For example, the market rents, right? That matters. Interest rates, the supply of housing we talked about, right, is a big impact. But it is also true that increasing the cost of housing, decreasing its value, has a general upward pressure on rents. The economic reasoning for that is it makes sense. If you decrease the value of a building by increasing the tax, you are in a competitive environment, and so the investor is not necessarily going to just accept a loss in value, right? The investor goes and invests in some other city. So to make that up, you either have to reduce the costs of the building, which means worse service, less investment, for example, or you have to increase the income of the building, which is higher rents. I've seen modeling anything from like 2 to 10% increase in rents. Again, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but you're definitely not, I don't think anyone would argue that you're reducing the cost of rent or you're reducing rents, right? You're generally creating an upward pressure or a pressure to have increases in rents. I'm going to come back to this one when we talk about property taxes as well. I'm going to come back to multifamily housing. So then in office buildings. Office buildings, again, are bearing the brunt of this proposed increase, so you got to consider the context of the office industry. And the context for that, you're probably all, I would hope, familiar with the fact that it's not great in the downtown office market right now. You probably think that it's entirely a function of working from home and COVID. Maybe if you read some papers, you think interest rates are impacting. Both very, very much true, but we actually are in our competitive, and I'll show this in our competitive position, was actually decreasing from that 2015 high I mentioned pretty significantly. I think we dropped about a fourth of what we were in 2015 in terms of investment before the pandemic even started. This was in 2019. Again, that's about $6.5 billion to less than $2 billion, all before the pandemic. Now we're in the pandemic, we've got work from home and all that going on. Where are we? On the busiest days of the week, our office buildings are about 60% empty. That's a head count. When you look at vacancy, that's how much space is unleased, is at a record high. We have enough vacant office space in downtown to fill 16 Willis Towers. I'll let that sink in for a moment. 16, yeah. So I'm gonna get to that actually. If you're familiar with how subleasing works, right? If you're a tenant and you are not going to use your space again, or you're not going to lease it again when your lease expires, you list it for sublease. So that's an indicator of us that people are going to leave their leases. Sublease listings are the highest they've ever been in recorded history. So with this mix, we are seeing, market participants are estimating that our office buildings have lost anything from 40 to 80% of their value. That's a little bit hard. We haven't hit the bottom yet, so it's hard to bear that out yet because we've only had one sale so far this year in terms of downtown office buildings. It was a 60% loss. But what we're hearing is so far we're right in the middle of that target. So that's a bright spot, I guess. And as I said, we really haven't hit the bottom yet in the market because nobody's investing. Everybody's kind of waiting, or they're going into some form of receivership or foreclosure. So this will be a multi-year, possibly 10-year plus recovery cycle for our downtown. I want to just show you this again, going back to 2015. It's again in the mindset of office buildings are not people, they're not mansions. It's important for us, it's hard to talk about what's too much in a vacuum. Nobody knows what is an acceptable profit in an office context, right? These are abstract. So we always show people, think about it, or tell people we really have to go after our competitive position. So this is a vastly simplified, just cleaned up. I took out all the names except for Chicago. What you're looking at is these are the sales in dollars of downtown office properties from 2015. Again, that was our high water mark to, it's an estimate again of 2023. We've only had one. Compared to our competitor cities. That's what everybody else is. Chicago is this big red bold one that stands out. Everybody else is everybody else. New York is not on this list because it's just a different scale and you wouldn't be able to see anything going on. So again, in 2015, you'll see this is our peak. We were leading the pack, right? We have a very strong competitive position. And again, you'll see this is what I was talking about, the essentially dramatic reduction in investor interest in our market. Again, to 2019, it's before the pandemic ever started. That's really what we focus on is what is our competitive position and how are we promoting that, because that at the end of the day is how we're getting investment to the city. So what is driving some of this significant drop? Again, a lot of different factors go on, right? Real estate is cyclical, but we can say with very, very high confidence that our real estate tax policies absolutely play a role. So again, the function of our industry is go out and recruit investment, permanent investment, right? This is right into the very fabric of the city to Chicago. And when our folks do that, without question, the two biggest stumbling blocks we hit when they're making those pitches are public safety and tax policy, real estate tax policy. Starting in 2015, again, going back to this, you'll probably not be shocked to learn that starting in 2015, the city of Chicago started increasing property taxes very deliberately to meet what's called the actuarially required contribution, the ARC level of funding. If you followed anything about the city's pension funding crises, the ARC funding is, this is the amount of money you actually need to make sure your pension funds don't go insolvent. Property taxes historically are the main source of revenue for that because they're very reliable. So starting in 2015, the city started dramatically increasing that. I think by 2019 in our office market, it was about a 35% increase in tax bills over that 4-year period. And you'll see certainly a very clear correlation of decrease in investor interest. We just, as of this year, hit the unfortunate distinction of having the highest commercial property tax in the country. And I always like to point out to folks, that's not us in New York and LA and all the big cities, it's us, Detroit, and Providence, Rhode Island. It's not a group that we want to be in. Not to get too technical in terms of how commercial real estate works and office market works, but when you pay rent in an office building, unlike say in an apartment building, right? An apartment building, you have a 1-year lease, you have the rent, and you pay the rent, and then at the end of the year, you get a new lease. And if there's higher costs, they sort of slowly start to bake that into new leases. In the office market, you pay generally your proportionate share of the building's expenses. So property tax is coming straight to you, no matter what the amount is. That's yours. So is energy costs, labor costs, those things. So in our market, the highest portion of your rent, it's about 22%, is property tax. No other part of your rent is as large. That is larger in Chicago, that proportion, than any of our competitor cities. It's higher than our utility costs, it's higher than our labor costs, it's higher than any other part of what your rent goes towards. Transfer taxes were also, it depends how you measure, but we're also 4th or 5th highest among our competitors. So we have a very high comparative tax burden, and we know that that's a problem when we're trying to recruit investment. So that's the kind of context of the office industry. Why is kicking that industry when it's down bad public policy in our view? And how does it cost the public? There's a few different ways. So one thing most people don't realize, has anybody ever heard the Cook County assessor talk about how downtown doesn't pay its fair share of property taxes? Anyone? Okay. What he doesn't tell you, among a lot of other things he doesn't tell you, is that by law, office buildings and commercial property actually subsidizes everybody else's property taxes. They are actually assessed by law at about 250% what residential property is assessed at. So the consequence of that is that residential property, I mentioned earlier, makes about 90%, 98% of the property value in the market. It only pays half of the property tax bills. So there's a pretty heavy subsidy. Not all of that is office, not all of that is commercial, but it is a pretty heavy subsidy nonetheless. And so if you're familiar with how the property tax system works, it's not a rate. You see it on your bill as a rate, I'm making this up, 10%, but the city and the taxing bodies don't say, I'm gonna set it at 10%. They don't care what the rate is. They set a levy, they say, I want $100 million. They're gonna get $100 million from the property tax. The whole process of assessment and all of that is just to determine how you split that $100 million up amongst the tax base. So, because it is a levy, as you have office values collapsing, that amount that they were gonna pay still gets paid, but by everybody else. And so some back of the envelope math is that if you're talking about a 40 to 80% decline in downtown office values, it's about a 9 to 18% increase in everybody else's property taxes. Again, that's mostly condos, single-family homes, it's a residential tax base. And this is for a $250,000 home, it's about $450 to $900 annually. Coming back to multifamily, they also pay they're assessed at the 10%, same as the 10% rate that residential, the single-family homes are. Even though they're considered, you might think of them as commercial property, they are also the beneficiary of the subsidy. So they are also, property taxes are gonna go up as a result of this. And again, there's another annual kind of pressure, upward pressure on rents. There's a whole other host of reasons. I'll kind of run through these just for timing purposes, but a whole bunch of other public costs. And again, going back to this theme that office buildings are not people, they're economic activity. That activity and the investment that we recruit supports tens of thousands of Chicago jobs, and it's across every demographic in the city. So our industry manages the buildings, and basically every component of Chicago's office industry is unionized, except for the 4 or 5 people in the building that are the managers of the building. So the security guards you see at the front desks are all Local 1, SCIU Local 1. The custodial folks are all SCIU Local 1. The engineers are all Local 399. Everybody that does work in our buildings, from maintenance and the trades, everybody who builds the buildings, all union, all representing the whole swath of the city. Again, every demographic, all of them rely upon that investment that the industry brings. Again, another just sort of marker in terms of actual office construction, which again supports many, many jobs. It was about 25% at the end of 2019, what it was, the end of 22, what it was at the end of 2019 before the pandemic. And even just the mechanics of not having the people in the building, I mentioned 60% empty headcount-wise, has a lot of other additional impacts on the public costs. So basically the $750 million to $1 billion crisis facing the public transit system, because we don't have workers in office buildings anymore. That affects everybody in the city. We're all paying for that one way or the other, not even counting the issues it's caused with service among transit agencies. The fact that you don't have as many people downtown is creating new strain on public safety resources and demands for public safety resources, when previously the fact that you had so much density and so many people on the street meant that you didn't need that. And then of course there's a loss of other taxes. Just to pick the topical one, this is the transfer tax. So this is our 2015, at a high water mark, it's about $50 million in transfer tax that was coming from sales. It's really only about 80 buildings, and you can see again that kind of collapse. And then we had a little jump in 2022, and then in 2023, again, it's been almost non-existent. And if you're following the city's budget process, they've actually baked in part of their multi-million-dollar hole was coming from the transfer tax being lower than their initial estimates. So on the flip side, that's some of the public costs and how this proposed funding mechanism of being entirely transfer tax is more than just the mansions, right? It does affect everybody. What are we getting from it, right? And again, homelessness impacts everybody in the city, and it certainly impacts businesses, even if you're, again, one thing I always like to tell people is, without any bias whatsoever, that the office building industry is the best industry in Chicago from the perspective of public policy. If you wanted any one industry to do well, you should want downtown offices to do well, because, again, the core function is going to sell the city and bringing money to the city. Even if you look at that, forget the fact that it's Chicago, it's our industry, our people live here, we're a home team. If you look at it from the most cynical perspective, homelessness affects office buildings too. When you have encampments out there, people don't want to come into the office, right? It affects our return to office policies. When you have investors, you're trying desperately to get an investor interested in the building, and when they're visiting, they have to drive by a homeless encampment. That matters. All that stuff affects the perception of the city. So, what you would hope with any really big, complex public policy challenge is that I would personally say, you want to attack it to solve it, right? Don't nip around bugs. You want to knock this thing out of the park. You want to get all the stakeholders together. You want to align on the scope of the challenge, right? The scope of the problem you're trying to solve. When you start talking about 6,000 on the street homeless or 65,000 double, what's really the target here? What is the most effective way, according to the experts, we're not one of them, but according to the experts, what's the most effective way of solving it? How much is that going to cost? How do we pay for it? In that order. And really in this context, we have not done that. The state of the current plan is very abstract. There's really been no analysis behind how much funding, what are we doing? How much funding do you really need to solve the problem? Initially it was 160 million, now it's 100 million. You saw from Daniel's comments earlier that the plan is to have a committee that's going to figure out the goals and metrics later, right? So what are we doing with that $100 million? It's not nothing. It comes at a cost. And on top of that, this sort of notion that they're doing the reduction of the existing tax is pure politics, right? If you didn't have to do this at a referendum, nobody's asking for that. And if the goal is to really solve homelessness, that's something like $25 to $30 million a year that you are giving up from existing city revenue, basically to pass this at the ballot. So our ask throughout this process has really been, there's no inherent reason that you have to fund. One, you need to have a better plan, and there are experts in the room on this, and hopefully there is a plan somewhere, but you need to have more engagement with a lot of other folks. There needs to be some portion of this plan that makes it easier to develop market rate housing, NOAA housing as you refer to, that's not part of this conversation. But once you have a better plan, there's no inherent reason it should be all funded from transfer tax. And so our ask really has been, let's go look at the rest of the tax base. Homelessness affects everybody. It makes more public policy sense to spread that tax thinly, but very broadly, so that you're not sort of putting the entirety of the economic impact onto one industry, particularly an industry that's already getting kicked pretty hard. That's really it. That's kind of where we are, and happy to answer any questions.
We're running really late, so let's take just a couple questions from the audience. We'll skip my questions, because I would like us to spend at least a little bit of time at the tables talking with each other. So let me get the mic.
Thank you. You can read your question.
I think it'll sound like something that we just heard. But my comment is as follows. I am very concerned about the timing of this proposal given the dire state of the commercial property market, especially in the Loop. I fear we will end up with higher property taxes on residents and no fewer unhoused people.
Thank you. Is there any comment from the panel? Okay, our next question or comment?
Sure. As I understand it, over the history of the city of Chicago, the downtown area has transformed itself many different times to address the evolving needs of the community and sometimes economic pressures that require it to do so. So my question is, if it's true that for the thousands of factors that you mentioned, the downtown space, the commercial real estate situation is no longer viable, essentially, what's getting in the way of owners of those buildings of transitioning into residential spaces, if that's what the city really needs?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I'm going to try and give you the most concise answer. Two things going on. One is that because of the timing of interest rates, you're actually seeing a lot of owners, the way that they have loans structured, so the loan is floating or the loan ends, it's coming to ending, and then they're just losing control of the buildings altogether, and so it's going in some form of receivership or to banks, and then who knows kind of where we're going from there. The underlying challenge with those conversions is that office buildings of the same size, say as a residential building, are worth much, much more than residential. And so for an office building to actually pencil out, for it to make sense to convert to a residential building, the value of it has to drop huge, this kind of huge. And then on top of that though, you also find that there's a bifurcation in the office market where you've got Class A buildings, newer buildings, fancier buildings, they're doing okay. There's not as many of them, but they're still able to attract tenants because there is a group of tenants, big banks, a lot of financial folks that feel very strongly that they need to have their people in the office, and they're willing to pay more on the fancier office buildings, newer office buildings, to have all the amenities to try and get people back into the office. So they're generally doing okay, but then the older buildings that are not, and will not be office buildings likely in the next 5 years, don't have the infrastructure to be desirable residential buildings. They don't have the right floor plates, they don't have the right access to light and air that you need in a residential building. And so the cost just keeps kind of mounting in the downtown core part of the Loop. A lot of them are landmarked, so that's the whole conversation on LaSalle Street. So they're actually, city laws against, and federal in many cases against you just demoing them and kind of starting from scratch. And so it's very difficult to make that work. There are, the city has this pending from the prior administration a proposal to use city funds as tax increment financing to cover that gap and actually make some of them turn over. The theory, and we support it, the theory being that you're making a better environment for the rest of the office buildings and the rest of the investment. We are all anxiously kind of waiting for the current administration to wrap its head around that and decide what it's going to do. I will just pitch, going back to my comment about office buildings are the best in the industry. Remember that a residential building is not a one-for-one exchange for an office building in terms of the economic benefits. One, it's not paying property taxes the same way, right? It goes back to that 10% assessment. But also you don't have people using as much transit to get there. They're not going out to buy lunches, go to shows, take clients to shows, right? You have less economic activity. Again, we need it. I mean, we need residential, but it's not a simple process. It's not a simple conversion.
Let me just ask a question, not to you, but about procedure. Are you all willing to stay like an extra 15 minutes?